This is the 8th day of March, 1967, and this is Guy Ross, and I'm talking today with Mr. Raymond Fields, the publisher, and several other things, I guess. Why don't we start, Mr. Fields, with just your childhood, where you grew up and so forth, and then come on up.
Well, I was born at Center in Pontotoc County, Oklahoma, Indian Territory at that time. And as old Bob Kerr used to say, Raymond and I were born 10 miles apart and 10 months apart. And how in the world can he be a Republican? And when I was at the age of 3, we moved to Wetumpka, which is a new town founded on the Frisco Railway in Hughes County, Indian Territory. And at the age of 5 plus, almost 6, we moved to Okemah, which was then opening and did open on April 22nd, 1902. And I started in the primary class of school there and went through to my junior year as a student at Okemah. And that was the year when cotton hit the very bottom. Maybe $10 or $12 a bale was all you could get. And they had the buy a bale movement. Each merchant would put bales of cotton out on the sidewalk in front of their store. And my father went broke, and I was forced by economic circumstance to go to live with a sister at Cedarvale, Chautauqua County, Kansas, where I graduated from high school in 1916. Then I came back to Okemah and became part owner of a haberdashery that also did cleaning and pressing. And I ran the cleaning and pressing establishment and taught school at Pleasant Valley, 5 miles north of Okemah. And I had a athletic scholarship at Kendall College, which is now Tulsa University. And in order to keep myself in physical trim, I would run that 5 miles each morning and back. And then in April of 1917, World War I was declared. And I resigned my school and went immediately into World War I went with the Tulsa Company, and we were the only Oklahoma unit in the Rainbow Division, which was gathered from 28 states of the Union and was named by Major Douglas A. MacArthur, then the Chief of Staff. He later became brigade commander and came back at the age of 38 a major general in command of the Rainbow Division. We were in 7 engagements. In France, we were at the front lines for 9 months with only 3 days relief. And when I came back, I married my boyhood sweetheart from Okemah, Mildred Ballard, on June the 8th, 1919. And therefore I had considerable responsibility, and I had to find something to do. And I had always liked newspaper work. And while I was overseas, I had written large numbers of letters back about the war, and I don't know how they got by the censor, but they did. And they were widely published in Oklahoma, in the Daily Oklahoman, and the Oklahoma News, and in my hometown papers at Okemah. And so I applied for a job to Mr. G.B. Parker, who was editor of the Oklahoma News. And Mr. Parker later was to become the editor-in-chief and lifetime trustee of Scripps Howard Papers with his offices in Washington. He was one of the 3 trustees of Scripps Howard Papers.
Isn't there an interesting story about, as I understand it, you went up in overalls or something to apply for the job?
I had to work. I had this bride, And we hadn't announced our wedding. We'd gone to Yukon in Canadian County and got our license to marry at El Reno in Canadian County. And we were married by Reverend Bailey, a Baptist minister at Yukon. And I was working in the harvest field. I didn't know I'd been away for 25 months in the service, World War I, and I didn't understand the economy. When I left, $2 a day was a handsome wage. When I got back, I could make $5 a day in the harvest field. And so I went to the harvest field and worked for Louis Yunkerman at Banner, Oklahoma, between El Reno and Yukon. Well, you in those days traveling as a harvest field worker and following the harvest on north, you didn't carry any clothes with you. You took your overalls and your underwear and your shirt down to the pond at night and washed them out, and you slept bare between sheets out in the barn. And that was my life at that time. So I saw that after harvest, I was either going to be a manual laborer or I had to find myself a professional job. And so I went to, on a hot Sunday in June, to Oklahoma City by the Interurban, which operated at that time. And in order to save car fare, I walked about 15 blocks. No, it was more than that, about 20 blocks. It's approximately where the University Hospital is now, to see Mr. G.B. Parker. I'd called him on the phone and made the engagement. And I was in my overalls and work shirt, because that's all I had with me. And Mr. Parker talked, and we reminisced about the war, and he asked me about my experiences, which had been very wide and dramatic in a way. And so he said, well, he was interested in me. He said, what college did you attend? And I said, I do not have a college education. And he said, well, I'm very sorry. He said, we hire nothing but journalism graduates. And I said, well, that counts me out. And so I got up and talked a little more, started to leave, said goodbye to him, and if I'd have taken one more step, well, my entire life would have been changed. But just as I reached for the doorknob, he said, Fields, wait a minute. He said, if you have guts enough to walk out here on a hot day in your overalls and ask me for a job, I've got guts enough to give you a trial. And so he hired me at $17.50 a week. And I went to work on July the 8th, 1919, on the Scripps-Howard paper at Oklahoma City, the Oklahoma News. And then I still intended to go to college and had some cleaning and pressing equipment bought, by which I was going to make away from my wife and myself to attend Oklahoma University and study journalism. And Morrison R. Toomer, who was a journalism graduate at Oklahoma University, or most of them were, on the news staff, said to me, he became city editor. Fred Tarman at Norman was my first city editor, and he discouraged me staying in the newspaper business. He said I'd never make it. And Toomer said, if you'll stay with me, I'll teach you more journalism in 1 year than you'll learn in 4 years down at Norman, because I've been through it. And Parker had been through it also, and Edmund Tier and a number of others on the news staff, executives. So I stayed. And Toomer gave me a wide spread of assignments, which were really educational. He even made me a sports editor for a brief time. And then I was made a State House reporter. And when Toomer stepped up to be managing editor, well, he made me city editor within about 2 years. This would be about 1921. or maybe early 1922. He made me city editor. And then Toomer, on October 22nd, 1923, suffered a hemorrhage of the lungs. He had arrested tuberculosis from his service in Siberia. And that was the day of declaration of martial law over Oklahoma. Jack Walton was the governor at that time. And I stepped up to be managing editor. And E.A. Ted Evans, whose father was the second president of Oklahoma University, came from Cleveland, Ohio, Scripps Howard paper there, the News, Cleveland News, and was the editor, and I was managing editor. And I remained until, I kept saying that I had the ambition to be a country newspaper publisher, to get a paper of my own. And in May of 1925, I just severed all ties. Said I'm going out and try to get a paper of my own. And I had an engagement with a gentleman in Tulsa, an oil man, who said he would finance me. Well, I raked and scraped all I could to put up for the Guthrie Daily Leader at Guthrie. They asked me $5,000, and I raised that. I mortgaged my home in Oklahoma City, and then I went over to this gentleman in Tulsa who was a sincere, honest person. Thompson Building, there's name for him, and told him that I had an option to buy the Guthrie Daily Leader for $50,000. That they had originally asked me $100,000 without the buildings, and I'd threatened to kind of go in competition. And Leslie Niblack was a man of wealth and liked the easy life, and he was the publisher, and he kept coming down and down and down until they gave me an option for $50,000, including the buildings, two 25-foot, two-story buildings. And I went back to Mr. Thompson and told him what a bargain it was and all this, and he said, well, Raymond, I'm very sorry, but I've had to make some capital investments lately, and I've used all the resources I have, and I can't help you. Well, that left my option money of $5,000 up, and I was broke, and so the time I had a 30-day option. The time approached when I think they were about 3 or 4 days left. And somehow or other, the name of Lou Wentz at Ponca City came to my attention. I believe it was because a sister-in-law of mine, Mrs. Roger Rogers, here in Oklahoma City now, had worked for McCaskey and Wentz in Ponca City. And Mr. Wentz had later bought out the McCaskey interests. So I went up and sought an interview with Mr. Wentz, and he talked to me in his apartment in the old Arcade Hotel, and he was very much interested, and he said, by the way, are you any relation of John Fields? Now, John Fields was quite a personage in Oklahoma's history. He was with the Capper Publications. He'd come here as editor of the Oklahoma Farmer, but he'd left the newspaper profession, was now president of the Farmers State Bank at Sheridan and Robinson. It was then Grand Avenue. I said, no, I'm not related to Mr. Fields, but I'm well acquainted with him. I covered his campaign when he's the Republican nominee for governor against Jack Walton. I made several of his meetings. And he said, would he recommend you for this? I said, well, he's a banker now, and bankers normally don't recommend that loans of this size, and it was a large loan in those days, be made without they have an interest in it. And I said, I don't know. He said, I'll go down and talk to him about it. So I was traveling by train. I took the Santa Fe and went back to Oklahoma City. Went to see John Fields and told him the situation. Now, I'm of the opinion that overnight that Lou Wentz had called John Fields and talked to him by telephone. I can't say that for sure. But Mr. Fields went over. He didn't even have a stenographer. He operated an old Oliver typewriter. And he went over at this typewriter and picked out something, put it in an envelope, and said, "Here, take this up to Lou." Well, I was rather encouraged because I didn't feel he'd send me off on a dry water hole. And I took it up to Mr. Wentz. He opened it and read it. And he said, "Have you seen this?" And I said, "No, I haven't seen it." He handed it to me, and Mr. John Fields said, written, "I am not now engaged in the newspaper profession, but if I ever re-enter that business, the first partner I would seek would be Raymond Fields." And Mr. Wentz picked up the telephone and called the Security National Bank. L.K. Meek was president. He called Mr. Meek, and he said, "Send me up $55,000 in cash." And they brought it up in a shoebox. And Mr. Wentz said, "Here's $55,000. Go down and take that option up." And that would leave me $10,000 operating because I had 5 up. And I was paying $50,000 for the paper. I went in, Mr. Arthur E. Beyer was president of the First State Bank at Guthrie, and that's where the money was up. And I told Mr. Beyer to call Mr. Niblack from just across the street and tell him that I wanted to take up my option on the paper. And Mr. Beyer was a German banker, an old farmer, fine person, very cautious. And he said, "Well, how are you going to pay it?" He talked in a rather nasal tone. And he wouldn't take a check. And I said, "Well, get him over here. We'll settle it." And I had this shoebox under my arm, which I'd almost crushed through on the train coming down. And he said he wouldn't even take a cashier's check because the bank on which it was written might go broke meanwhile. I said, "Well, get him over here. Let's get this transaction over." And he called him over. Raymond Beyer, who later was president of the First State Bank, son of A.E. Beyer, and Raymond's wife now is president of that institution at Guthrie, told this story until his death. We were close friends. We walked back to the cage, and I took the lid off this shoebox, and I said, "Start counting." and it was an epic story. And I assumed the ownership and operation of the paper on July 1st, 1925, my first newspaper. Mr. Niblack put on his hat and walked out, and I didn't see him for years and years. The next time I saw him was at his home in Tampa, Florida, about 20 years later. And he just left. And so I operated the leader with my brother-in-law and partner, E.M. McIntyre, who is in the real estate business in Oklahoma City now, until 1942 in May. I went back into the service in World War II, and McIntyre was left in charge. Then he sold out. Meanwhile, I'd accumulated a large number of newspaper properties. The second one I had, I bought the Okemo Ledger in 1926. That was my old hometown, and converted it into a daily. The Cromwell boom was on, and Okemo was a town of 6,000 or 7,000 population. And then we absorbed the Okfuskee County News, the other weekly there, and that daily still exists and only changed hands last week. Mr. Scully of Henrietta bought it. And I don't know the sequence of purchases of the newspapers, but I believe Capitol Hill was the next one, Capitol Hill Beacon. And then I was interested in the Blackwell Tribune and the Fairview Republican, established the Bethany Tribune, and was interested in the Weatherford News, the Guyman the Texas County News of Guyman, which is the last property, that was converted into the Texas County News, Woka Times Democrat, and a number of other papers, all scattered all over the state.
You eventually owned 14, as I...
Well, we had 16 titles. Now, 2 titles might be in one plant, like let's take Guthrie, the Guthrie Daily Leader, and the Oklahoma Leader was a weekly. And but we had, at the time of Mr. Wentz's death in 1950, we had 9 corporations, and I'd been the president and manager for these corporations when I went into the service in May of '42. And then Phil McMullen took over during the interim. He now publishes a daily at Garland, Texas.
Did you eventually sell your interest in these before going to
Mr.
Guyman?
Wentz's death, his will provided that all of his properties had to be liquidated. Everything had to be liquidated within a period of 6 years. We had a construction permit for a radio station at Guthrie. It had been quite expensive to get. It had been contested by a group in Enid, and we had hearings in Enid, Guthrie, Washington, and it cost us several $1,000s to get the engineering, but we won it. And that was existent at the time of Mr. Wentz's death. Well, there was no need of putting in a radio station when I had to sell my 50% interest within a period of 6 years. And we'd had to go right through the same mill with the Communications Commission. And so I dropped that. I had the alternative of, I think I could have financed the purchase either at Guthrie or of all the papers we had, outstanding interest. I had an interest in all of them. I had any interest ranging from 22% in the Oklahoma News Press Corporation, which operated Fairview, Weatherford, and Blackwell, to 50% at Guthrie. And I think I could have financed the purchase of all or any. And I decided at my age, in 1950, I was 53 years of age, had no family obligations, that I liked Guyman. And it had been appraised for $96,000. And I had that much coming to me from the Wentz estate. I mean, I'd accumulated. I owed them plenty. But after the selling at appraised values, like Guthrie was $184,000, well, I'd get my half of that as a credit, and all around the Horn the same way. And so my wife was rather concerned. Here was Guyman sitting out there, and then the capital of the Dust Bowl, and had bad days and all this. And I kept dickering, though, with Merle Long and Tom Prentice, who were the administrators of the Wentz estate. One day I was offering them $40,000 on the property that had been appraised for $96,000. And one day I was up there and I said, well, if you folks decided to take my $40,000, well, they were leaving for California to have an interview with Mr. Wentz's brother concerning his estate. And they said, we'll just talk this over. And they went into a room and came out and said, now, Raymond, this is the last chance. We'll not bend a penny further. But you can have Guyman for $50,000. I said, we'll start writing. I recently sold it for something over $300,000.
My lands.
And so I went to Guyman and took over on August the 1st, 1950. And I quadrupled the income between that date, 1950, the gross income, and the date of sale, February the 1st, 1966.
What steps did you take to do that?
Just plain old local newspapering, just emphasis, heavy emphasis, all emphasis on local news. I wasn't competing with the Amarillo papers nor the Daily Oklahoman. Those were the only 2 dailies that came into Guyman. The Times didn't come in. And I just carried local news for the local people. And my slogan was a good newspaper for a great community. And that paid dividends, just pressing local news. And we had our categories of news. Local was number one heavily. State was number two. National was number three. International was number four. And we'd pare down for 6, 8, or 10 or 12 pages, and maybe just run a paragraph of a wire story, just the lead paragraph if it told the story. But local, the smallest story was a big one.
That's interesting. I'd like to drop back here a second and get you to comment on several things. There was considerable competition, I take it, between the Oklahoma News and the Times.
It was in those days. It's their business and not mine. But nowadays I go out to the Capitol and I see even the press associations and the newspapers pooling their news. A reporter will go cover a story and he'll cover it for everybody, and vice versa. I mean, another reporter will go another place. In the days when I was a reporter, it was a vicious, competitive game. You certainly didn't exchange news with anybody.
I'd like for you to comment on the story I read about the news frustrating the Times from keeping them from reading their editions or something when you put out the one.
Well, we got out about 45 minutes later. Our street edition, now in that day, street sales were very, very important, much so than now. The newsboys cried their papers on the street, you know. And we got out about 45 minutes later than the afternoon Times. And they had a reporter. He had started work for the Times the same week that I had started on the news. And I just learned recently in New York that he had passed away. Harold Mueller. He wrote a column also in the Times, Art Gum. And Harold was sent to grab the first edition of the news and make a run for the telephone in the old Hudson Hotel building and call in if we had something that he knew they didn't have. And thereby we couldn't get a scoop at all. We couldn't get an exclusive scoop. So Mr. Parker formed a conspiracy. Harold had asked for a job with Scripps Howard, and he was being seriously considered. And so one day Mr. Parker framed a story about a beautiful nude woman with a diamond necklace and all this. Her body was found in the weeds on West Reno, far out, about 2000 block or something, beyond May Avenue. And this story was framed and put on the press, and a checking copy was taken off the press. Then Wiley Montgomery, the foreman of the press room, was the only person who knew that this was a conspiracy. We had a cripple boy named Sid McDessie, who was the street sales foreman. So Sid took this lurid story about the girl being found out, beautiful girl, evidently a girl of culture, being found out in the weeds, her body being found, and he started across crying it, and Art Mueller grabbed the paper, bought it, and he made a run across to the Hudson Hotel and called into the Times. Well, in that day, there was a lot of competition between the police department and the sheriff's department. They were just about as competitive as newspapers were. So the Times called the police department first and asked, did they have any detail on this? Well, rather than admit ignorance, they said, no, but we're working on it. And so then he called, the Times called the sheriff's office and asked them, said the police were working on this case. Did they have any information? No, but we're working on it. We'll get some information later today. So the Times came out with the banner line on this story, and only one edition had been, only one copy had been run off by the news. There was only one copy in existence. Well, Fred J. was then on the news. Later he was on the Oklahoman. And Fred broke into conversation with Harold Mueller, who had the paper in his hand. And he said, Harold, Mr. Parker wants to talk.
Caught him out on the street somewhere?
Well, yeah, there at the Hudson Hotel.
Oh,
It's all framed. I mean, everybody was, you had to do it by clockwork. And he said, Mr. Parker wants to talk to you. You wanted a job with Scripps Howard, and he wants to talk to you about it. Well, the news was just at 407 West Grand, just a few steps. And so he beguiled Harold up into Mr. Parker's office. And Mr. Parker said, I haven't seen the paper today. Is that one? The news. Mm-hmm. And he took possession of the only copy of the news that had been run off. And the Times discovered the phony story, and they rushed all over town trying to pick up those papers, but a number of them had been sold. They never tried again to take our news. And then we had several other scoops. Now, when I say we had scoops, don't think that we didn't get scooped also, because we did. Walter Harrison, an eminent newspaper man, a firebrand, was the managing editor of the Times, and I was managing editor of the News. But I did scoop them on martial law. And that was a major national story. There were top correspondents in Oklahoma City from all over the nation, covering the fight of Jack Walton with the Ku Klux Klan. And we knew there was going to be a declaration of martial law. We didn't know how wide it was going to be. And on this Saturday afternoon, I was passing the City Hall on Grand Avenue and Broadway, and Charlie Ruth, who was a Supreme Court commissioner, came out. And Charlie had had a few to drink, and he liked me and I liked him, although we fought each other desperately. The news fought Walton and anybody connected with Walton. And he said, Raymond, I've got a story here that you sure would like to have. Well, I knew it was the declaration of martial law. Walton had him draw it up, and he'd been in the City Hall there, although he's Supreme Court commissioner, not a Supreme Court judge, Supreme Court commissioner. And I said, well, Charlie, you and I have been friends a long time, and you've never given me anything of great importance. This was Saturday afternoon. Other reporters weren't around. And finally, I wheedled him into giving me a copy of the Declaration of Martial Law. And Mr. Parker was here because Morrison Toomer had this hemorrhage, and I was practically a neophyte in newspapering, although I was managing editor and acting editor at that time. And it was such a critical time, this fight between Walton and the Klan. And so I took it down to Mr. Parker, and I wanted to run it off right now. And they were going to have a press conference at Walton's home on North Hudson at 7 o'clock in the evening. And the place was jammed with correspondents from all over the nation. And so I sent Grant McGee, our city editor, up there, and I said, now, and we had set this up and had run a checking copy of it off the press, and we were ready to go. But Mr. Parker reasoned that if we ran it off and put it on the streets, that they would change the declaration and we'd be embarrassed. And so I told Grant to go up there and take his copy and say, well, I'll have to call my managing editor, Mr. Fields, because we don't accept anything in secrecy. And he called me, and I said, "Is it what we have?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I'll hand it back to the governor and tell him we can't accept it. It wasn't for release until midnight." And so he handed him back his copy. Well, the press conference broke up, and all these correspondents made a run for their hotel rooms and everywhere scattered to write their stories. And within 5 minutes, we were selling extra editions in front of Governor Walton's house and on the streets in Oklahoma City. And it's a matter of record in the Associated Press. Couldn't release it until midnight because they'd accepted it under those terms. And they, their dispatch said, "The Oklahoma News says tonight that martial law has been declared as of midnight." And the News, of course, was Scripps Hard Paper, which owns the United Press, the competitive service. But they had to carry that the Oklahoma News said this rather than... Then we had one other very startling... Am I boring you?
No, sir.
Scoop, I think, was perhaps... It wasn't as important, but it was as big as the scoop on martial law. Now, martial law was declared October 22nd, 1923, and it was placed over the entire state. And machine guns were mounted by the National Guard under General William S. Key at every county seat in Oklahoma. And it was a very critical time. Anything could have happened. And Walton was impeached and tried and removed from office as a result of it. Well, the Oklahoma News took this position. They were against Walton, they were against the Klan. And Mr. Parker and Walter Ferguson spent hours on hours trying to devise an editorial policy for the News because we were in the middle of the situation. Finally, they came up with the theme, and it went all through the editorial: "We want neither Klan nor king." And certainly it was quoted all over the nation as an outstanding editorial, one against the Klan, one against Walton the King. And this other scoop I started to mention was when I had gone to Guthrie on the Guthrie Daily Leader, publisher, and about 1 o'clock in the morning, I was a client of Associated Press. Well, here came over a paragraph that said that Charles F. Urschel had reportedly been kidnapped. Well, Urschel was a multimillionaire oil man. He had married the widow of Tom B. Slick, the Wildcatter King, and Urschel had been married to Mrs. Slick's sister. And Slick had died, and Mrs. Urschel had died, and he had married Mrs. Slick. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Urschel and Walter Jarrett and Mrs. Jarrett were playing bridge on their screened-in porch, as I recall it, in the north part of Oklahoma City, North Harvey, I believe. And Machine Gun Kelly and his gang came and kidnapped Urschel and Jarrett and held them for ransom. Well, here this little paragraph came over, and I knew, of course, that instinctively, and anybody would know it's a big story, the biggest nationwide story. And so I called the Associated Press, and they said, well, that from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. They said, that's all we can get. They've surrounded it with FBI and officers, and they won't let reporters within the block. And I can't get anything. We can't get anything. It's just a report. They've been kidnapped, and that's all we know. And this was 1 o'clock in the morning. So I took a chance, just shot in the dark, and I called the Urschel home. Well, who should answer but Fred C. Clark, the Republican state chairman and my intimate friend. I was active in Republican politics at that time. And I asked him, had they been kidnapped? Yes, they have. And I asked him the detail, and he gave me the detail. Then he said, would you like to talk with Mrs. Urschel? And I said, of course I'd like to talk to Mrs. Urschel. So I talked to Mrs. Urschel, I talked to Mrs. Jarrett, and got all the detail of the kidnapping. Then I called Police Chief John Watt. Well, Jarrett had been released, but they had retained Urschel. And Jarrett was in Watt's office. Well, the same circumstance prevailed. They wouldn't let a reporter inside the police station. Not Watt's office, but the police station. The FBI was in charge. And I knew John Watt very well, knew him intimately, and I asked him about circumstances and so on and so forth. He said, well, Jarrett's been released. He's sitting here. Would you like to talk to him? And I said, well, of course I'd like to talk to him. Well, we'd lived next door to the Jarrett family when I was a little boy in Wetumpka, and we'd kept up a margin of acquaintanceship, not a lot, but he knew who I was and I knew who he was. So he gave me the full detail of the kidnapping and the release, and the next morning, it was Sunday morning, there was nothing on page 1 except the Urschel kidnapping. And the Oklahoman went through all of its editions, and that's a matter of record, and it's in this biography research. They went through all with a report that Urschel had been kidnapped. Well, I printed 10,000 extra copies and sold them on the streets of Oklahoma City of the Guthrie Daily Leader. Well, Mr. Gaylord was so irked, publisher of the Oklahoman, that Walter Harrison was attending the coronation of King George V in London, that he wired him and brought him back home immediately. He didn't even get to stay for the coronation. But it was a monumental scoop. There wasn't any question about it. But luck favored me.
I wonder if I guess this is a matter of that newsmen would know, but do other newsmen find out how you do these things after you've done them, or is it a great
yes.
puzzle?
As a matter of fact, on the martial law scoop, Governor Walton liked Mrs. Fields and I, although we were on the opposing side. He called us his children. They didn't have any children, and they'd take us to dinner and all this, and Raymond, where did you get that story? Smiling, I'd say, well, I don't reveal my news sources, Governor. And he'd say, oh, you know it, I know where you got it, you might as well confirm it. No, I'm not going to confirm or deny. But he haggled with me for a long time to know. He knew that Charlie Ruth had given it to me because Charlie Ruth had drawn it up. And they find out, now in the Urschel kidnapping, my recollection is that they followed up with a story about our scoop, and I gave them the detail that I'd talked with the Urschel home and talked with Walter Jarrett and talked with Chief Watt. And then Slick had an oil partner in Tulsa who finally delivered the ransom for Urschel, Kirkpatrick. And Mr. Kirkpatrick wrote a book on the Urschel kidnapping, and he included the Guthrie scoop, Guthrie Daily Leader's scoop, and how it came about in this book. Yes, everybody knew, and we got scooped plenty, but we scooped some too.
After you went to Guthrie, then after you were there for several years, then you got into American Legion?
No, I was active in the American Legion in Oklahoma City. As a matter of fact, when I went to Guthrie in June of 1925, I was vice commander of Post 35 at 10th and Robinson, which is one of the 4 largest posts in the nation. And I was chairman of the committee that bought the present home site where the Legion Post 35 has its home now. And I was active from the time I was discharged in 1919. And but after I went to Guthrie, I was named post commander there immediately. Of course, I couldn't be post commander. I probably would have been post commander at 35 in Oklahoma City the following year because I was first vice commander. But Art Sleeper was post commander there, and he was busy or an illness or something and vacated the post in August after I came there in July. Well, I was named post commander. And then I immediately got the state convention of the American Legion for Guthrie. I think it was 1927, and that was a lark. It was something. It rained and they were all inside the hotel. It was quite a convention. And then at that convention, yes, it was 1927, I was elected 5th District Commander. Well, the 5th District then comprised Logan, Oklahoma, Cleveland, McLean counties. And I made every post in the district with what I called two raid. And old Luther Harrison would go along with me. He wasn't a legionnaire, but he had a brother killed in the Rainbow Division with which I'd served in World War I. And he would make the principal talk. It was one of the most touching talks, and he'd always close with a poem that he had written concerning the returning of soldiers, and his brother wasn't among them. And he had been in the state senate, and he was a noted orator. He was the editorial writer finally. He was from Holdenville then. He was editorial writer finally for the Daily Oklahoman, and a brilliant writer. And then in 1928, usually they elect a commander, and then they state commander, and then they elect him national committeeman or somebody who has been state commander. But I took it in reverse. I ran for national committeeman at Ponca City in 1928 and was elected, and served 3 terms, 6 years. And in that time came the big Wall Street bust and the Depression. Well, in 1924, the adjusted compensation bill had been passed nationally over the veto of President Coolidge, and Oklahoma was not for this the adjusted service measure. In other words, we were refusing a bonus, you might call it. Most people call it bonus, but we were not for it. But along came 1931, the depth of the Depression, soldiers, servicemen selling apples on the street, out of work, and all this. And here we were holding this script that the government had issued in 1925. Mine amounted to the maximum, which I recall was $1,665.
When was that supposed to be?
It was to be payable in 1945, 20 years after the enactment. And so I conceived the idea, I was national committeeman, of immediate payment of the adjusted service certificates. And they amounted to $4 billion, oh, now I want to get this right, $4,300,000,000 in the nation. Well, of course, I didn't know what that amount of money was. I just didn't know. And it went to 3,862,000 veterans in the nation. Well, I felt that this money was thrown in. It wasn't a new debt for the government. They had already declared the debt that would be paid in 1945. Well, my argument was this. You go into a bank and they say, what are your resources to get a loan? What are your liabilities? And you list your resources and you list your liabilities, and you say, well, now this isn't due until 1945. Well, the bank would say to you right back, yes, but it is a liability. So this was a liability on the government. It wasn't anything new. We held the paper, we held the script that they had issued. And so I thought it should be paid immediately to help in a time of depression. And I was able to secure, the only time in history, Milt Phillips, now publisher at Seminole producer, and myself worked all night in getting a special call of the National Executive Committee of the American Legion at Indianapolis over the head of the commander who opposed us, Ralph T. O'Neill of Kansas. And we met in Indianapolis, and I made my argument before the National Committee, and it was adopted. And the Legion, from then on, campaigned for immediate payment.
Well, what happened then?
I beg pardon?
What happened then after you had
In 1931, at the Detroit Convention, it was rejected by a narrow vote. President Hoover appeared. He had refused a place on the program. And that night, a committee met and tried to iron it out, a legislative committee. The committee was composed, the chairman was Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was the chairman, and Hanford McNider of Iowa, who later was before that was national commander of the Legion, later was ambassador to Canada, and John Stell, who was later national commander of the Legion and governor of Illinois, and perhaps my most intimate friend, and Sam Reynolds of Omaha, Nebraska, and myself. Well, it was divided 3 and 2. Stell and I were for immediate payment, and the other 3 were for some sort of a deferred plan. I don't remember what it was. But when we couldn't reach an agreement, and I said, I'm going to present the minority report on the floor tomorrow, and I felt the convention would uphold me. Teddy Roosevelt and McNider called President Hoover and said their Legion is going to adopt the policy of immediate payment of the adjusted service certificate if you don't come up here and battle it. Well, Andrew Mellon was his Secretary of Treasury, and he wasn't about to pay it if he could help it. So Hoover, very spectacularly, I picked up the paper at my hotel the next morning, and here was the streamer. Hoover was to address the convention that day in opposition to immediate payment of the adjusted service certificates. And so I presented the minority report, and by a very narrow margin was defeated. In 1932, the convention was in Portland, Oregon, and I was on the legislative convention committee again, and went to a blackboard at Lincoln High School in Portland and wrote a resolution without a whereas, inasmuch or therefore in it. The American Legion is hereby pledged to work for the immediate payment of the adjusted service certificates, and so instructs its legislative representatives. And that was passed in the convention by 13-1 majority, and within 6 months, the first half, they paid it in 2 sections. The first half had been paid.
I remember reading in this biography that you have reflected that you think that if this had been passed the first time, that perhaps Hoover wouldn't have been defeated.
I'm a Republican, and I was secretary and publicity director of the Hoover campaign in Oklahoma in 1928. Therefore, it isn't a prejudiced viewpoint. But I feel that if President Hoover had let this money, $4,300,000,000, go into the hands of 3,800,000 servicemen, that the Depression would have been erased immediately, and that he would have been a re-elected president. This was 1931, now remember. He was defeated in 1932.
Well, when the war came, you re-entered your military career, this time as an officer.
Yes, I'd been, I knew General MacArthur. That's rather an interesting sidelight. And when Pat Hurley of Oklahoma was Secretary of War, I would visit him in Washington occasionally. And one day he said, Raymond, you know my chief of staff, General MacArthur. I said, no, I can't say that I do. I served under him both in his regiment and in his brigade and in his division. But I was buck private, and you know the relationship between a private and a general. I used to see him in the front lines, and he was there all the time. He wasn't in a dugout. And he pushed a button and said, come in, Doug. And we had lunch together and reminisced and all this. And so when I started to leave, it was the most interesting visit. Well, General MacArthur said, well, Fields, this has been a most enjoyable visit. Said, if there's ever anything I can do for you in Oklahoma in a military way, please let me know. And I said, well, General, I'll tell you. I served 25 months under your command, even starting when you were a major. And I came back with your division when you were a major general. And I served on 9 fronts, and I had 2 injuries, one bagasse and one small shrapnel. And you never saw fit even to recommend me for first-class private, so we can just let this military stuff go now. And he just laid back and roared. And thereafter, he always called me his permanent and grade buck private. And I used to correspond with this Hanford McNider, General McNider. He was the commanding officer of the 189th Combat Team in the Philippines when MacArthur re-entered the Philippines. And he's a banker at Mason City, Iowa. He doesn't write script, he writes pig tracks. And so he'd write me a letter, and down the bottom he'd say, P.S. The General sends his regards to his permanent and grade buck private. I still have those letters. And I went back in World War II. I didn't have a commission. I wasn't in the reserve. In May of 1942. And Pearl Harbor, of course, had been in December of 41. And I had to go in the Provost Marshal General's office as a military policeman. That's the only thing I could get in. That's where they put all we retreads, as they call us.
How old were you at this time?
Well, 42, I'd be 45. And so I went to school at Camp Williams, Utah. Took my training there, and it was really rigorous training. Even jiu-jitsu. And for a man of my age, that was pretty rough. But then I was assigned to the San Francisco Port of Embarkation, or the Oakland Army Base right across from San Francisco, as an MP officer. And I also was publisher of the Service Night. This was at Camp Night, K-N-I-G-H-T. And I published the camp newspaper, the Service Night. And so one day I was busy at something, I forget what it was, and Colonel Alfonte, the commander of the camp, called me over. Well, I thought something was wrong, thought it was in connection with the newspaper, the paper, because the only way we could finance it was to run ads and collect them, and the only ads we could get were liquor and bar ads. And I thought I was going to catch it on that account. Got over there, and he said that the general wanted to see me over at headquarters, San Francisco Port of Embarkation, General Galbraith. Well, I thought the same thing. I'm in trouble somewhere. So I was shining my shoes away and getting my brass polished to go over, and my wife came up. And she said, what are you doing all this for? I said, well, General Galbraith sent for me. I don't know what it is. I may be in trouble. And so I went over there. Well, I knew his secretary. And she was laughing and chatting. Well, I felt, well, I'm not in any trouble, I don't believe, because she would have been serious if I had been. I went in and gave him a best salute to the general and said, Lieutenant Fields reporting, sir. And he said, he didn't even return my salute. Said, sit down, Fields. I want to talk to you. He said, you know the commander of the Legion, do you not? I said, yes. Read, what's his name, down in Stockton. I know him very well. And he said, no, I don't mean the state commander. I mean the national commander. I said, yes, Roland Waring of Tennessee. And he said, well, I've been with him for 4 days on an inspection of all of our coast installations. And he asked me, didn't I have a Lieutenant Fields in my command? And I said, I didn't know. I didn't know him. And he said, well, you better get acquainted with him. Said, if you hadn't been such a hot pants patriot and got into the service, he'd be sitting here beside you instead of me. Now, I think there's some doubt about that. I'd ran in 1940 and was defeated very narrowly for national commander at Boston by about 20 votes. And I planned to run in 1941 and got out of the way of Ed Scheibling of New York, who was a supporter of mine. Ed was elected. No, he wasn't elected that year. He was elected later. And in 1942, I was going to run again, and Waring had ran and was elected. And I think he exaggerated. It had been a battle. I'd given him a battle, I'll say that. But so General Gilbreth immediately said, I'm going to transfer you to Los Angeles Port of Embarkation. I have a mission there for you. Well, the Los Angeles Port of Embarkation was a subport to San Francisco, and that hurt Los Angeles pride tremendously. It wasn't a full port, and they had a delegation in Washington all the time trying to get Los Angeles made an independent port. Well, my mission was to go down there and persuade 3 million Los Angeles residents that they ought to stay a subport of embarkation and not try to be a port of embarkation. Mm-hmm. And so he sent in my promotion to captain immediately. And I was made a captain soon after I arrived in San Francisco. Of course, I couldn't carry out my mission, and Los Angeles became independent. But I was director of intelligence and public relations for the Port of Embarkation at Los Angeles. Then when it became an independent court, General James K. Herbert took over. He was colonel at that time. And he was number one in his West Point class, 36 years old, brilliant, and he built the Los Angeles port tremendously into a major installation. And then I was some help, I think, in getting him his general star. And he made me the director of labor relations, which was a most exciting and challenging job because I was director of labor relations for all the ports of embarkation for the Transportation Corps on the West Coast. And as such, I had contact with labor personages such as Harry Bridges, who was then under deportation order, and Dave Beck, the Teamsters Union at Seattle, and others real importance. And I represented the Transportation Corps on the Pacific Coast Maritime Board. Now that was a board that had 2 labor members, 2 shipping members, and 1 public member. The public member was Paul Eliel, professor of economics at Stanford University. And I attended their weekly meetings and naturally came in contact with both shipping executives, labor executives. And when I left the service, I just put a frame around this day before yesterday. I was given the Army Commendation for accomplishments as labor relations.
Let me pause right here to turn that tape over. Our time's got about a minute on it.